good.
So now we have, finally, Annalie Newitt with the censoring mob of,
Thanks. Sorry about that. I almost got censored by the fact that I own a Mac Air, and now we've resolved it completely. So my background and my interest in this topic has evolved for a while. I'm a writer, and I write about the intersection of science and technology. And I've worked in journalism. I've written for places like Wired, and I'll talk about something that I did for Wired actually momentarily. But I've also thought about these ideas in a policy context. I worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation for a couple of years and dealt with issues around censorship there as well. And now I run a blog called IO9, which is devoted to science and science fiction. So that has really pushed me into thinking about censorship as it's taking place on the web through what we think of as something called social media. Sometimes it gets called Web 2.0, which is actually a term that I hate and I hope will be eradicated. But it basically refers to web applications and services that were built basically in the last 5 to 8 years. And so I'm interested in how censorship is mutating and taking on new forms as we're seeing new kinds of media production, and specifically media production where users, and not necessarily professional writers or professional musicians or professional code makers, are creating their own content online. So you're not getting a top-down media, you're getting a bottom-up media. So what happens when you have grassroots media, bottom-up media, when you have censorship? How does that censorship work? Which is why I'm interested in the censoring mob, not so much in the censoring state or the censoring big bad, but the kind of all the little brothers who are censoring you too. So there's a lot of ways to talk about this, and I'll start out with a little story that has to do with a social networking site called dig.com. How many people have used Dig? A few. So Dig, which is spelled D-I-G-G, just so that it's extra cool, I think it's mostly popular in the United States and other English-speaking countries, but it's basically a news recommendation site. And it's very, very popular. So the front page gets, millions and millions of hits. And so any piece of news that gets modded up to the front page gets a tremendous amount of attention. And people spend all day long submitting story ideas to Dig from other news sites. So I might see a story on the New York Times and say like, wow, this is neat, submit it to Dig, and then other people either decide to dig it or bury it. Let me show you what that looks like. So here's a page on Dig that I used to look at a lot. They don't actually have, it's not quite organized like this anymore. But you'll see stories coming up. And you can see here that you have the option to bury the story with the X or dig the story by clicking on the little button that says dig it. And as it gets dug more and more, it comes into more people's attention until, through some secret sauce algorithm, it hits the front page. And so this is just sort of their little description of what digging and burying means. Oops, let me go back. So what I wanted to do was, I felt like instinctively that Dig was an incredibly corrupt system for bringing news to people's attention. It was sort of touted in the United States as being a very democratic way of gathering news because everybody got to vote on it, which, as you know, in the US we sort of fetishize this idea of voting because we only have like 2 choices in every presidential election. So we get so excited about the idea of voting. So, and here, indeed, you only have 2 choices. Again, you can dig or bury. And so I thought, well, there's got to be, there's obviously corruption in the system. There's corruption in any voting system. And so I decided to do a semi-scientific experiment, which I luckily got Wired to pay for, and turned it into a story. And what I did was, I wanted to create a piece of content that was incredibly stupid. and then submit it as a story and see if I could bribe people to dig it and get it onto the front page. So at this time, which was a couple of years ago, there was a group of anonymous troublemakers who, I hope they're here, it would be great to meet them. They formed this thing called User Submitter, and what they would do is you would give them $1 for every dig that you wanted to buy. They would take 50 cents and they would give 50 cents to one of their legions of bribed diggers, and those people would dig your story. And so it was being used for SEO, and it was quite a popular service, and the people behind User Submitter told me anonymously that quite a few journalists were using their service trying to get their stories onto the front page of Dig so that they could get lots of traffic. So first of all, I made a deal with them. I gave them about $300 bucks, and I said, I want 300 digs for this story. And then I created this blog called crowdhacking.com, and if you're on the interwebs right now, you can look it up. It is the worst blog ever, okay? It is filled with random pictures that I found. They're all CC licensed, with really bad, ungrammatical commentary. And the whole theme of the blog was pictures of crowds. And so here I have, look, it's a symmetrical looking crowd. I like this crowd because the light makes everybody look very symmetrical, I said. This is a true crowd where everybody blends with everybody. So this is, this is the kind of amazing commentary that I included in this blog. And if you go visit, you can see I also actually had a little moment where I included herds as well as crowds, just to kind of spice things up. So I submitted, so I created a fake account and I submitted this blog as a story because it's so awesome. And after a couple hours, it still didn't have any digs. And so then I called in the User Submitter guys, after I'd given them the 300 bucks, and they started pinging people and having them dig it. And it wound up only costing me about, it wound up costing Wired only about $100 to get this on the front page. And so finally, at the front page, the story about my amazing blog came up. And actually, most of the comments on it, not paid for comments, actual legitimate comments, were favorable. There were a couple of people who said, why the fuck is this on the front page? But to be fair, people say that about everything that hits the front page on Dig. So what we managed to do was not only trick Dig into putting my shit-tastic blog on the front page, but also we tricked people who would not normally have dug the story into digging it because they saw this critical mass of other people digging it. And so we kind of tricked, we tricked the system. And this is actually one of the more pernicious and I think difficult to talk about kinds of censorship that go on in social media, because it's not actually censorship, right? The fact that my stupid blog got on the front page of Dig didn't directly censor anyone. It isn't like because of that people got less news about the war in Iraq. But instead, what it does is it pushes, it allows you to use popularity, to use either buying votes or getting votes in some other way to drown out perhaps more unpopular voices. And my story is just an extreme example of what goes on all the time on Dig. The people who run Dig are constantly having to break up these juntas that form where people will form a group of diggers and they'll create an email list and I'll dig your story if you dig my story, and then we get all our stories on the front page. And there's been a series of oustings, actually, where people who are top diggers get kind of ousted from the community because they are revealed to have these kind of secret email lists where they dig stuff. But pretty much anyone who's popular and successful on Dig or on other sites like this, like Reddit is another good example, and a lot of other social media sites that aren't edited, you really have to have a gang of friends who you're constantly negotiating with to get your content on the front page, which means that sort of unpopular content falls by the wayside. I found my notes. So basically what I'm talking about is an emergent kind of censorship. It's not the old kind of censorship. It's a new wave, or it's a new type of censorship that I think we're going to be seeing more and more. And I want to give you a few more examples and just talk, but before I do, I want to talk about a few of the characteristics of this new kind of censorship, this new kind of corruption in social media that we're going to see more and more of, and that I think we as skeptical consumers of the media should be aware of as we're going into the future, where you're getting media from peers as opposed to from news organizations, large corporations that hopefully you already don't trust. And this, I guess this is reasons to not trust the other organizations too. So one of the things about the new kinds of censorship that I'm talking about is that it's coming from the bottom up, not the top down, which is to say groups of people collaborate together to destroy free expression. It is collaborative. You can't do it, very rarely can you do it on your own, that you can eliminate unpopular speech from a social news site. Usually you have to have some kind of group that you're working with. And this is a really important issue. The next one is that this kind of censorship places an undue burden on speakers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. And that comes out of sort of an American idea of what free speech is and not necessarily a European one. And finally, these kinds of censorship may be punitive. And I'm going to talk a little bit toward the end about griefing and trolling and how that kind of inhibits free speech in social media spaces. But there's also a good side to that. And also, I included at the end this notion that this kind of censorship may or may not be within the terms of service of the different social networks where it's taking place, because sometimes it actually is within the terms of service of, say, Dig, that you bury stories that are unpopular, but that doesn't mean that it's not censorship and that it's not sort of socially troubling. So let me go through a few quick examples specifically about how censorship of this kind places an undue burden on the speaker. And actually there was a very interesting talk a couple of hours ago about search engine censorship, and I feel like some of the stuff has already been gone over, so I can go over it fairly quickly. But one of the characteristics of social media networks like Flickr or Blogger or other kinds of like music sharing networks is that when you put your content up, like when I open a Flickr account, which is a photo sharing service, and I put up my photos for anyone to see, there's always a way for other users to flag them. And actually, here's an example from Blogger, which is Blogspot. It's Google's blogging service. And so you sign up, and so this is actually a really fantastic blog, building blog. It's, I highly recommend it. But what you can see up there, I have the red arrow pointing, is it says flag blog. So you can read the blog, but as a user, you can also flag the blog as having objectionable content. Now, if enough people decide to get together and flag this blog, it will stop being indexed by Google. So I can find it because I know it's buildingblog.blogspot.com, but if I search on it, it's not there anymore. So it's disappeared. People have gotten together, and although they haven't eradicated speech, they've placed a burden on the speaker. They've made it much, much harder for that speaker to be heard. And in US law around free speech and in our first, interpretations of the First Amendment, which is the amendment where we talk about free speech, one of the issues that gets brought up over and over is that free speech isn't just the right to come up and yell about how much Google is great and Microsoft sucks, but also it's the right of the speaker, the person who's speaking, to not have burdens placed on them in order to talk. And those burdens could be anything from suffering harassment in their community to actual like financial burdens. Like if you want to talk, you're going to have to pay $10, or you're going to have to pay €10, which is even worse. So this kind of burden is that if you're going to say what you want, you may have to not be searchable. Or you may have to fight with Google and say, actually, my blog deserves to be searched. I think I just lost, anyway. So there's a lot of other sites that use the flag button. And they're quite aware. I mean, this is actually from Blogger. If you look up there, they actually have said the flag button is not censorship, and it cannot be manipulated by angry mobs. The fact that they say that indicates that they know that it has the potential to be a form of censorship, and actually it can be manipulated by angry mobs, because if you get 50 of your friends to flag a blog, that's going to severely inhibit the blogger's ability to get heard. So I like that they have this, this disclaimer here. If you think that you've been flagged in error, you can petition Blogger and you can say, hey, I'm an unimportant person that you don't care about using a free service. Please help me. Yeah, good luck with that. I can tell you stories, but I won't. Here's another example of flagging. This is on YouTube. This is from one of the best movies ever made, Ghidorah versus Godzilla. But you know, I think it's a little inappropriate for YouTube. So here I've flagged it, and I have an opportunity to pick why I'm going to flag it. And so I'm flagging it because there's physical attack. Okay, a three-headed monster is attacking a one-headed monster. I'm offended. Very offended. So I flag it, and a message gets sent to YouTube. I've actually, for the past couple of days, I've been having a back and forth on email with some of the lawyers at YouTube about their flagging system, because unlike other sites, YouTube will automatically take stuff down, like a bot will remove content if it gets enough flags of the right kind. And I've been trying to get them to tell me which kinds of flags and how many are required before it gets taken down. And they're being a little bit closed-mouthed about it. But when I publish a version of this paper, and I'll put a link on the wiki, hopefully I'll have a concrete answer from them on that. But it definitely is automated. So you can test it out. Go pick on the Ghidorah video and see how many flags it takes before it gets automatically removed without any human oversight. So again, you can see how that might function as censorship. No human oversight whatsoever. Me and my friends go in to persecute Ghidorah, and look what happens. Flickr is a really interesting case. Again, Flickr is the photo sharing social network. People use it a lot for political purposes, as well as artistic expression and just, you know, vacation photos. Flickr, actually, I just spoke with Heather Champ, who's their head of community at Flickr, because they have things like heads of community there because it's a social network. And she assured me, and I think this is true from my experiences, that a human actually reviews every time something is flagged. So it's never going to be taken down just because it's been flagged and then some algorithm has been flipped. So what you can do on Flickr is, when you flag it, you can ask them to review the safety level of the photo. You can only do this if you're already logged in to Flickr, so you have to be a user in order to flag, which is different from Blogger. And also, what it does is it allows the Flickr administrators and sort of the abuse department to respond in a number of different ways to a request for a flag. So a request for a flag could result in the photo being removed if it's considered infringing or obscene. But oftentimes, if it's something that's erotic or perhaps shocking, what they'll do is they'll just give it a higher safety level, which means, again, it doesn't fall out of the index, but it's harder to find. So it does place more of a burden on the speaker. And I'll give you an example, which is kind of weird. But Heather from Flickr was telling me that one of the most controversial photos they've ever had was a photo that someone took of a cat that had been killed on the railroad tracks, and its head had been cut off, and then someone had come along and spray painted a tag on the cat. So they'd spray painted graffiti on the dead cat on the railroad tracks. which is an interesting artistic statement. It's weird, and you can see why someone would photograph it. And it went up, and immediately it just got a ton of flags from the community because people felt that dead cats were tragic and obscene, or whatever they thought. They love their cats, they don't want to see dead cats. So basically what they did was they elevated the safety level of the photo to the highest level. So you had to be a member of Flickr, you had to go through some hoop pretending that you were 18, proving that you were 18. So it became less easy to stumble upon. Another example from Flickr that's political in nature is that there was an angry mob that tried to get a series of photographs of war protests removed. This was back in 2005. And Cindy Sheehan, who's an American anti-war protester, a big public figure, was protesting in front of George Bush's ranch, protesting against the war, and she was posting live from that protest to Flickr to show people the size of the protest and what was going on. And a lot of Republican, well, we assume, let's say a lot of pro-war individuals decided that those photographs should not be available for public consumption. And they did flag them and report them repeatedly, and they were taken down but then put back up again after the case was examined. So again, you could see how if the person hadn't been using Flickr, if Cindy Sheehan hadn't been using Flickr, had maybe been using Blogger, for example, and 50 angry people came to her Blogger blog and flagged it, no one would be able to find those photos. So you'd search on like Cindy Sheehan, go to Google, search on Cindy Sheehan war photos, and it just wouldn't be findable at all unless you knew her exact URL. So that's political censorship in action right there. I'm just going to skip. So these are just some of the pages from Flickr where they let you ask to have your account reviewed. And I would simply end my section on flagging by reiterating that the main problem with flagging is similar to the problem with search engine style censorship, which is to say it places a burden on the speaker. So if I want my photos to be seen by everyone, and they've been flagged up to some crazy level of safety, I have to fill out this form, send it to Flickr, wait however long it takes for them to review my account, and it may take a very long time, it may never happen. So in order to speak freely, I have to go through all these hoops. And the same thing applies with YouTube or Blogger or any number of other services that have this flagging function where they automatically take content down if enough people consider it to be unacceptable or to have too much fighting in it or whatever. So the final thing that I want to talk about before we break for questions is the problem or the question of griefing, which could also be trolling. A lot of people don't like the term troll anymore. I don't know, it's some kind of like politically correct troll thing. Don't call them trolls, call them griefers. Anyway, I just want to tell I think we all have had experiences with trolls. In fact, we just had a troll experience a few hours ago up here on stage. I don't know if you guys were here, but or with griefers, you know, they're people who come into your social network or your social space online and make everyone miserable, although initially they seem to be friendly. So let me tell a quick story about how one griefing experience unfolded last year. So how many people are familiar with the Something Awful website? So a few people, okay, Something Awful is kind of like a more literate version of 4chan. I don't know if people would, so that kind of makes it lamer than 4chan, but it kind of makes it the thing that people who think of themselves as too good for 4chan, they go there and they do the same things they would do on 4chan. So it's basically just a place where you hang out and you just make fun of everybody in the meanest possible way. For what? Yeah, for the lulz, okay? So it's all about the lulz. And so last year, a person came to a feminist science fiction convention. You can already imagine how this is going to unfold on Something Awful. I was actually there at the convention, although I didn't know that all this stuff was going on. So they came to this convention called WisCon, and it's a convention filled with very earnest people who share their feelings and talk about science fiction and nerdy things. And this woman came and she took pictures of a ton of people, including me actually, at the convention, and wrote mean things on the pictures and wrote nasty, created weird things out of their faces. And her main obsession was how fat everybody was. There were a lot of fat women there, and that upset her. And so she posted all these pictures saying how fat everybody was and how they were all dykey and blah, blah, blah. And so, yeah, there was this great picture of me in my, Doctor Who suit, and she wrote, dyke. And I was like, yes, truth in advertising. That's fine, fine with me. So I wasn't as offended as some other people. But they wound up on the Something Awful forums, and it escalated from there. And what happened was, as griefing goes, these were people who had never really been griefed before. So they'd never had someone troll them in this way. And so a lot of the women and their families got very upset. And so they went into the Something Awful forums like, don't do that. But they did. And they went in and they started defending themselves and saying, how could you guys be so terrible and bad? And so, of course, the Something Awful people are like, ha ha ha, let me make you feel even worse. I will post your phone number. I will post your favorite dinner. I will, find pictures of your kids and make mean things out of them. And so indeed, they did. A lot of people's kids did get their pictures put in there, and it got really ugly. And eventually, what happened was you actually cannot find this on Something Awful anymore. There were enough complaints that I guess they kind of filed it in their archives, and you have to be a member of the forums to see it. And then a lot of the resources associated with this feminist science fiction convention, including a very comprehensive wiki of feminist science fiction literature, they actually took them down because people were coming across the Something Awful forums and decided that they would deface anything associated with this group, which included this wiki, which really was just an informational resource, which is now back online. But so they actually, and a lot of people deleted their live journals, which sounds like, the beginning to every terrible story, and then she deleted her live journal. But they did, and the point is that this episode of griefing from the Something Awful group, or people associated with the forums, caused these women not only, the pain and the sadness of being grieved, but it actually did cause them to take down a lot of content related to feminist science fiction in the end. And so it was, it's a really, griefing is a really interesting case of censorship that could really only happen in an age of social media where people are producing their own content and where anyone can become a celebrity that we make fun of for being fat or being whatever. And yet, I think it's something that, unlike these other kinds of censorship, isn't likely to go away, first of all, through any kind of regulation, and second of all, that it actually has an underside to it that's politically effective sometimes. So it causes censorship, but the other side of griefing, and this is what's so complicated, I think, about, here's just something, this is actually from the forums, so you can get a sense of what Something Awful did. Pictures of fat women with funny faces. But griefing can also be used in the other direction, right? Like it can be a form of grassroots censorship, it can be a form of grassroots, it can be a way that people shut each other down, but it can also be used very effectively, for example, in the case of Anonymous, who, I guess we didn't get to see the Anonymous talk earlier today, which really was depressing, but the group Anonymous has used griefing very successfully as a political tool to defang Scientology, And in fact, like, Scientology has taken one of the biggest hits publicly that it ever has because of this group of people organizing anonymously the way that people do on the Something Awful forums or on 4chan, and just griefing the hell, trolling the hell out of Scientology. And that's something that I think we don't want to see that go away. We don't want to see that kind of grassroots speech go away. And I just wanted to give another very American example of how griefing and trolling work as positive political speech, or as political speech that we might want to foster. I don't know how many people remember the Paris Hilton for President video, but during the last US election, the guy who was running against Obama, McCain, did a political ad where he said, Barack Obama is a celebrity, and he just wants the fame and the glamour of presidency, which is kind of hilarious. But anyway, he basically compared Obama to Paris Hilton, which again seems like such an apt comparison in retrospect, and I mean that sarcastically. But anyway, so Paris Hilton decided to do her own video about running for president because she felt so empowered by McCain, you know, comparing her to Barack Obama. So you can look this up on YouTube. It's just called like Paris Hilton for President. But she basically just sat in a lawn chair. The video was launched on, you know, a variety of social media networks. And she said, like, well, some old guy said that I'm just like this other guy who's running for president. So I think I'll run for president today. Here's some ideas I have about policies for economics. And she had a bunch of great ideas about fixing the American economy. And that was passed around a lot, especially obviously in the United States, because you know, we were all so anxious about the election. So anyway, so this was definitely a form of trolling. I mean, Paris Hilton trolled on YouTube against McCain, and I think it worked. I think people really responded to it. Possibly it even swayed a few voters that hadn't made a decision at that point. So I want to end by sort of concluding this discussion of emergent kinds of censorship by referring to a pretty old essay by Noam Chomsky, who's a political theorist and started out as a linguist, and even if you think his linguistics are dumb, he actually has some pretty interesting ideas about how the news media functions in the United States. And he's famous for saying that even when you have a free media, a so-called free media where everyone's allowed to express what they like, the media still labor under what he calls the bounds of the expressible. And the bounds of the expressible have to do with what we've been taught and what we have been led to believe are the proper kinds of things to say. And the way that those bounds around what's expressible get erected are through everything from socialization at home to the kinds of messages you get from the corporations that own the media organization that you write for. And in most countries in the developed world and also in the developing world, media that's top-down media often comes from a corporate-owned or government-owned newspaper or magazine or publication. And so when you go to work at one of those places, in order to even get in the door, in order to get a freelance gig there, in order to get an interview there, you already have to have demonstrated that you're not going to go, say, work at The Economist and suddenly start saying, well, capitalism is just wrong. Why don't we just abolish the system? You know, obviously we need, you know, a system of sharing, and we need to destroy the music industry because it's just bad, right? The Economist isn't going to look on that with, you know, very favorably, and you would never have gotten the job in the first place if you had that opinion. So that's the bounds of the expressible. And so that's the way in which the media polices itself, even when it's supposedly free. And what I want to argue is that in social media and in social news sites and social news services, that the bounds of the expressible really need to be expressed as the bounds of the searchable. So things that can be searched on and found, where there's no burden placed on the speaker to be found, to be indexed, you know, those are the kinds of expression that you'll see. You'll see only the kinds of expression that that these companies allow you to search on, and not just companies, but the people who are using the services created by these companies. So what you see on Flickr or on Blogger or on Dig is all of the things that are easy for you to find because a large community of people has allowed you to find them. They haven't flagged them and made them go away. So there's still this huge boundary around what we're allowed to say and be heard. And that's very, very important if you're interested in fully free speech, that speech it's not just about being able to write something somewhere. It's about being able to write something somewhere that people can find and that you don't have to fight to make them find it. I don't have to argue with Google for 2 months that my site isn't porn so that people can find it, you know, through Google, which I actually did have to have that argument with them. So I want to end there and open it up to Q&A. So thanks.
If you have any questions, there's a microphone in the middle of the audience. Please use this one.
Yes, you use the example of Flickr having human interaction before they censor something, but this isn't always possible, like on Facebook where you have content with this text and in different languages, like Dutch language. I don't think they have a lot of people working on that, and I have an example of a friend who got a hate group against him that eventually led to him losing his job and Facebook not interacting or doing something against it because I guess there wasn't someone to review it, or I don't know what happened, but it's not always possible, and especially in social media. There's so much content and there's only so much one person can review. What's your view on this?
Right, I think that's true, and I think that's why so many companies, he was saying that basically the bounds of the expressible has to do with language, because if you're writing in a language that isn't the main language of that social media site, you may never get reviewed by a human. And I think that that's true, and it's part of why a lot of companies use algorithms to remove content rather than using humans to review it, because they'd rather just say, all right, well, you know, like in the case of something like Orkut at Google, you know, suddenly all these Brazilians were using it. They didn't really have that many people on staff. I mean, now they do, but at the time that it blew up, they didn't have a lot of Portuguese speakers on staff. So it's easier with something like that to just say, all right, well, we'll just choose an arbitrary number between 40 and 60, and if they get between 40 and 60 flags, then it's obviously unacceptable to the community that it's aimed at, and so we'll just get rid of it. So you you have automated censorship, which can be completely manipulated by trolls or by political groups. Yeah.
Hi. You mentioned trolling as a tactic for mob censorship early on, and I'm not sure if you follow politics, but it's in America, the healthcare debates that are going on in America at the moment. There's a lot of right-wing activists going to these debates and basically trolling in real life, shutting down these debates and stopping it happening, which is obviously a form of mob censorship. Do you have any thoughts on how this tactic, which is clearly working both in the virtual world and the real world, can sort of be countered against?
Let's see. So are you asking whether there's any place for trolling in getting healthcare? Is that what you're asking?
No. Trolling is clearly a very effective technique. It's happening in the real world. So, what can we do about it?
Trolling the healthcare system. Right. Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, like any grassroots tactic, it's going to be appropriated by people with power, right? So that's a perfect example of, like the Paris Hilton video, you know, it's a group with power that appropriates the style of trolling in order to persuade people. So yeah, I think that that would be, I would class that as trolling for sure.
You claim that making information harder to find is basically also kind of censorship, because well, you had your example. You start with your example on Dig, where if it's on the front page, it's easy to find. If it's not on the front page, it's harder to find. But the point of many sites where people can vote for or against certain content, posts, whatever, is also to make the good stuff easier to find. I'm mostly familiar with Slashdot, for example, where every once in a while you get mod points that you can use to mod the reactions from other people up or down, depending on how valuable you think they are. And that means that the replies that are considered valuable jump out at you, and the ones that are useless and don't add anything to the discussion are hidden. But if you want to read them, you can read them. And I think that's really the important point. Also with Google, for example, Google wants the interesting, useful stuff on the top of the first page. If you make everything equally easy to find, then it becomes impossible to distinguish between what's valuable and what isn't.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, and I think, I mean, it's important that you raise that point, because the question is, do you want a totally flat surface where every piece of information is weighted equally? Well, we can't live that way, right? That's not how our brains function. We want certain kinds of information to pop up. We want that kind of, we want curation of our information so we don't waste our time reading every single thing that's ever been submitted to Dig versus the things that the community says are interesting, or every single thing that's been submitted to Slashdot versus what the editors think is interesting. I think there's a difference between a crowd that picks information for you that you might find interesting, or that might be relevant to your political life, versus a social media site that basically, by its very algorithm, that it's, you know, using algorithms, and by its very nature promotes an attitude of gaming toward information, which is what I think happens on places like Dig, that people play Dig like a game, not like a place where they're actually trying to get people to read important information. And so I think that's where things fall apart, is when people are encouraged to drown out important information just so that they can get the extra points of having gotten something on the front page. So I think there are ways of having social media where you actually do get valuable information from it. But I think that a lot of the way it's set up encourages censoring behavior and encourages crowd behavior that is not conducive to getting good information.
Yes, so trolling is basically the new form of censorship. Is that about right? Yeah.
I'm having a really hard time hearing people at the mic.
I'm sorry. Given trolling is basically the new form of censorship, and you can, as you gave with your Paris Hilton comparison, you can use it as well to counter trolling itself, but that would still be trolling. Can you think of a solution for this problem?
You're going to have to restate the beginning a little. Wait. Yeah. Oh, a solution to trolling. Well, in America, we always say the solution to trolling is more trolling. Although we don't put it that way, it's usually the solution to bad speech is more speech. which is why we have such a lovely public sphere in America, and why there's so many sort of dirty cigarettes in it. The solution to, I mean, it's very complicated because, as I was saying, trolling can be used for great justice. It can be used to bring down Scientology. And that's, I think many of us would agree that that is an important thing to at least undermine people's perceptions of Scientology and allow them to say what they want about it. On the other hand, it can be used to ruin people's lives and censor information about feminist science fiction. Trolling is kind of like, you know, lighting police cars on fire during a riot. You know, sometimes bad, sometimes good. Yeah. Oh, great, yeah. One more? Okay.
Let me just fit in another announcement. We have, after this talk, which is one other talk that's not in the printed schedule, so please don't leave yet. We have a follow-up to the WikiLeaks talk earlier today. If you're interested, just stay here and we'll do that after the questions were answered. Thanks.
So one more question? Or? Okay.
Hi, this is Kara from the Meta Lab. Well, one aspect that you didn't really mention is that this is corporations we are dealing with, and their goal is not to increase free speech. Their goal is to increase shareholder value. So I wonder, how do you think anybody's ever going to fix this? Because Google or Reddit or whoever doesn't have an interest in promoting free speech. They have an interest in getting people to go to their sites. And I think that this is the big question, that suddenly these issues of free speech and how do we give people these basic rights are in the hands of corporations. Do you have any thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. You know, whether we can actually expect any kind of free speech when the speech is being broadcast through corporations. You know, this is one way in which the new media is very much like the old media. You know, you never got, it's not like there was ever a magical time when you got news that was free from corporations. I mean, I've worked at a lot of independent media organizations for most of my life. And even then, even when I was working at an independently owned free weekly newspaper in San Francisco, it was still a company, and there was a party line. Even though we were a leftist paper, the guy who ran the paper was anti-union. I don't know why. He was an idiot. But we wanted to cover union politics, and we couldn't. And I mean, that's just a tiny example of, you know, what could happen at a much larger company where, you know, they have a lot more values that you might not agree with. So I think that the question isn't so much, you know, will the corporations ever care about giving us free speech? Because they never have. Political entities have rarely cared about giving us free speech. Usually free speech exists in the kind of collisions between those things, in the collision between the state and the corporation, or the collision between the law and the state and the corporation, or the collision between the citizenry using the law against the corporation, or the citizenry using the corporation against the state, which happens a lot in the United States. So I think that it's a matter of realizing that the corporation doesn't give a shit about free speech. And so that's why I say the whole thing about when your content gets removed from Blogger or Flickr, like hoping that you can just petition them to get your stuff put back up is foolish. I mean, maybe it'll happen, but they have no incentive, especially if it's a free service. Why do they care if your stuff is up there, you know? That for them, it's just, you know, your content is what brings more eyeballs to the site. So I think you have to go forward realizing the corporation is not on your side. You're going to have to be fighting against them. You know, either you can form your own independent organization that tries to disseminate news, or you can go about engaging in free speech the way we have throughout the past 100 years, which is trying to sneak it in. Trying to make, even though the company doesn't want to have that message, that you try to sneak it in somewhere, you know, try to write an article for Wired about why hacking is good. It's hard. I've done it, but you know, it can be hard to do, but it can be done, and it has been done. So I think there is hope, but you just have to be very skeptical.
Hi, I have a question for you. You're talking about freedom of speech, but isn't it more a freedom of choice? If you want to read something on Dig, because you dig it, you think it's a great site, you go on there, you know how the news is generated, you know how people vote, and something you want to see, you want to, you know, I think the system is great. If a lot of people choose an article, that's great, and you always have the choice of reading an article. If you read the headline, you think, well, this is something I might want to read, or this is something you don't want to read. Dig is the same as the news you see on Fox News, for example, but only then the selection is made by the editors of Fox News. It's very right, it's very biased, well, they call it fair and balanced, but it's something people want to see. Something people believe in, so you always have the freedom of choice. So I don't get it, what you're saying about freedom of speech. If you want to start your own website, you can. You can write anything you want. So if you choose to go to Dig, then it's something you like to read, right?
Okay, so there's sort of two answers to that question, or to that statement. One is that, you know, you're saying that, okay, you choose to go to Dig, it's your choice whether or not to read those stories that people like or that you like. And I think that actually it's not, that there's less choice involved than you think. And that's why I brought up that issue of the bounds of the expressible. Because, in fact, the range of options, now, and remember, the range of findable options on the web are actually much smaller than has been advertised. And the problem with something like Dig is that not only is it that there aren't that many news sources that are run by nerds that contain news that nerds might want, like Dig, but the people who are promoting news on Dig aren't necessarily doing it for the reason that they're supposed to, right? They're not doing it because they love that news or because they actually think it's worthy news. They're doing it because they're trying to game the system and get their story on the front page, which is why for like the past 2 years, every few months, the same story goes to the very top of Dig, which is hot chick in a Linux t-shirt, okay? How many people have seen that story multiple times on Dig? It's the same picture. But every few months, like, it comes back up to the top. And I'm not averse to hot chicks and Linux t-shirts. I'm just saying that that's not a perennial piece of news. People are putting that on there. I mean, maybe it is, but it's, you know, it's not something that people are putting up there because they're like, you really need to know this. Okay, they're putting it up there because they're like, dude, okay, we all can dig a chick in a Linux shirt, right? So it's not honest, is what I'm trying to say. It's not an honest form of news sharing. It's a form of gaming the news, and so people end up losing. And the unpopular voices, the voices that really need to be heard, don't necessarily get heard because people are too busy trying to game the front page to get their shit on there. So, I mean, that's really the missing link there, is sort of honesty in news promotion. Like, maybe you're the most honest digger in the world and you only ever dig stories that you think are fine and wonderful and that contain good scientific information. Yay, okay, you are the ideal user, but you are not the only kind of user, and you may not be the kind of user who's shaping that front page that millions of people go to and think of as a good news source. So there's two things. We want people to be more skeptical of Dig as a news source, but we also want to acknowledge that there aren't as many news sources as you want that are findable. I can start my own website, sure, but if I only get 10 hits a day versus millions of hits a day, you know, I'm effectively not being heard. And it's not a level playing field in that way. I have been given the signal that that is our cutoff. So I'm going to end by congratulating this person on maybe being the only good user on Dig, and end it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Annalie. Next, the much announced follow-up to the WikiLeaks talk.